The interview room was too small for the silence inside it. A single camera blinked red in the corner, the clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. And at the metal table, with his hands folded neatly in front of him, sat a 17-year-old boy who looked bored. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't asking for a lawyer. He was smiling. Detective Aaron Miles had spent 22 years interrogating suspects, drug traffickers, violent offenders, men twice this boy's age who broke down within minutes. But this was different. This kid leaned back in his chair like he was waiting for a bus. "Do you know why you're here?" Miles asked. The boy tilted his head, considering the question as if it were a riddle. "Because you think I did something," he said calmly. "And you want me to admit it?" His voice was steady, confident, almost amused. Miles exchanged a glance with Detective Rachel Novak behind the glass. Something about the way the boy spoke, measured, deliberate, felt wrong. Not nervous wrong, controlled wrong. On the table sat a thin manila folder. Inside were photographs, reports, timelines. 3 victims, 3 different locations. 3 crimes that, until yesterday, no one believed were connected. And now, sitting inches away from the evidence, was a teenager who seemed convinced he was smarter than everyone in the room. "Tell me your name," Miles said. The boy smiled wider. "You already know it." That was the first clue. Not defiance, not fear, but performance. Hours earlier, the call had come in just before dawn. A jogger had found something along the river trail, something that didn't belong there. No blood, no struggle visible, just a stillness that felt staged, almost deliberate. The victim was young, no wallet, no phone, no immediate signs of how it happened, but there was something else. Tucked neatly into the victim's jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper. 3 words, written carefully in block letters. "You missed me." That note changed everything. For months, investigators had been chasing separate cases and related deaths dismissed as accidents or coincidences. Different neighborhoods, different circumstances. No obvious pattern, until the note, and until a school resource officer made a phone call that no one expected. The boy's name had first appeared in a completely different report, a routine welfare check. A complaint from a teacher who said one of her students had submitted an essay that was unsettling. Not violent, not graphic, just disturbingly insightful. The essay wasn't about killing, it was about control. About how adults underestimated teenagers. About how authority figures relied on patterns and rules and how easy those patterns were to exploit. The teacher said it read less like fiction and more like a blueprint. When investigators pulled the student's file, they found something else. He had been questioned, briefly, in connection with one of the earlier deaths. Released within an hour, no evidence, no cause. And now, somehow, his words were sitting in a dead man's pocket. Back in the interrogation room, the boy leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You're trying to see if I'm scared," he said. "I'm not." Miles kept his face neutral. "You should be." The boy chuckled softly. "Why? Because you think you caught me." That was the second clue. He wasn't denying anything. He wasn't confessing either. He was testing them. Novak watched from behind the glass, her jaw tightening. She'd reviewed the boy's background twice. No criminal record, no history of abuse. Average grades, stable home, parents cooperative, if confused. Nothing that explained the calm precision unfolding in that room. "You're young," Miles said carefully. "You don't understand how serious this is." The boy's smile faded, just for a moment. "That's where you're wrong," he replied. "I understand exactly how serious it is. That's why I planned it this way." Planned. Miles felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Planned what?" he asked. The boy leaned back again, crossing his arms. This conversation. Outside the room, Novak was already on the phone. "Run everything again," she said. His internet history, his school projects, his messages. Anything involving psychology, interrogation, behavioral studies. There was a pause. "Yes," she added. "I know he's a minor. Do it anyway." Because something wasn't adding up. If this kid were guilty, he was too comfortable. If he were innocent, he was enjoying this far too much. Either way, he wasn't reacting like a normal teenager accused of something horrific. And that scared her more than any confession. Miles slid the folder across the table. "You recognize any of these?" he asked. The boy glanced at the photos, no flinching, no hesitation. He studied them like flashcards. "You arranged them wrong," he said. Miles froze. What? The order, the boy explained. Chronologically, sure. But not psychologically. He tapped the table twice. You're looking at outcomes, not process. Silence filled the room again. That was the third clue. He wasn't just aware of the crimes. He was critiquing the investigation. Miles closed the folder slowly. You think you're smarter than us, the boy shrugged. I think you're predictable. When the lab called an hour later, Novak felt her stomach drop. The handwriting on the note matched the boy's school records, not perfectly, deliberately imperfect. As if he wanted it recognized, but only by someone paying close attention. Someone like them. Novak looked back at the observation window, at the teenager laughing quietly at something Miles had said. This wasn't a suspect trying to get away with murder. This was someone who wanted to be studied. Someone who believed the system existed for him to manipulate. And as the realization settled in, one terrifying question rose above all the others. What if this wasn't the end of his plan, but the beginning? The clock in the interrogation room kept ticking. And for the first time, the detectives weren't sure who was really in control. Have you ever wondered what goes on inside the mind of a manipulator? Not just any manipulator, but a teenage prodigy obsessed with control, a boy who sees the entire world as his own personal game board. This is the story of Evan. On the surface, he's just a kid, but underneath, he's a master of psychological warfare. And caught in his intricate web are two detectives, Novak and Miles, who are about to face the most challenging case of their careers. The story begins with a seemingly straightforward crime, but as Novak and Miles dig deeper, they realize nothing is as it seems. Every clue, every witness, every piece of evidence feels placed. It's all too perfect, too clean. It's almost as if someone is orchestrating the entire investigation from the shadows, leading them down a carefully constructed path. Their prime suspect, Evan, a brilliant, enigmatic teenager who seems to know more than he lets on. When they bring Evan in for questioning, the real game begins. The interrogation room becomes a battleground of wits. Evan doesn't just answer questions, he deflects, he analyzes, he turns their own methods against them. He speaks in riddles and hypotheticals, discussing systems of control, chaos theory, and the very nature of human predictability. He's not just a suspect, he's a puzzle, and he enjoys watching them try to solve him. Novak, the seasoned, instinct-driven detective, feels an immediate sense of unease. He sees the darkness in Evan's eyes. Miles, the younger, more analytical detective, is fascinated, almost dangerously so. He's drawn to Evan's intellect, trying to find the logic in his madness. This dynamic creates a rift between the partners. Novak wants to break Evan to force a confession. Miles believes the only way to win is to play Evan's game, to understand the system he's created. But the deeper they go, the more blurred the lines become. Evan starts to manipulate them outside the interrogation room, planting seeds of doubt and paranoia. Small, inexplicable things start happening in their personal lives. A misplaced file, a mysterious phone call, a friendly neighbor who suddenly knows too much. Is it just their minds playing tricks on them, or is Evan's influence extending far beyond the walls of the police station? They start to question everything, their evidence, their colleagues, and even each other. The case becomes a personal obsession. Novak is haunted by the feeling that they are merely pawns, while Miles risks getting too close, sympathizing with the very person he's supposed to be hunting. Evan's goal isn't just to get away with a crime. It's to prove his philosophy, that anyone, even seasoned detectives, can be controlled if you just understand their system. He wants to dismantle their lives, piece by piece, simply to prove his point. The climax isn't about finding a smoking gun, it's a psychological showdown. Novak and Miles must confront the fact that to catch a manipulator like Evan, they might have to become manipulators themselves. They have to break the rules, bend their own moral codes, and step inside his twisted worldview. But can they do that without losing themselves in the process? The final question isn't just about whether they can solve the crime, but who will be left standing when the game is over. This is a story that will make you question the very nature of control and who is really pulling the strings. Thanks for watching, and if you're intrigued by stories that mess with your mind, make sure to follow for more. The courtroom was colder than the interrogation room. Not in temperature but in intent. Here, there were no games. No silence used as a tool. No mirrors to hide behind. Every word spoken would be recorded, preserved, replayed. Evan Harper sat beside his attorney, smaller than he had looked under the harsh lights of the station, but no less alert. He had expected this room. What he had not expected was how little control he had inside it. Detective Novak sat in the back row, notebook closed, eyes fixed on Evan. She wasn't here to interrogate anymore. She was here to observe what happened when a mind built on manipulation encountered a system that no longer needed his participation. The prosecution began carefully. No theatrics, no moral speeches, just structure. They didn't accuse Evan of violence first, they accused him of planning. The first testimony wasn't dramatic, it was technical. A digital forensics expert walked the jury through Evan's online footprint, methodical, neutral, devastating. The charts showed timelines. The documents showed intent. The list titled Errors was projected onto a screen, its simplicity somehow more disturbing than any image could have been. This isn't curiosity, the prosecutor said calmly. This is rehearsal. Evan shifted in his seat. For the first time since his arrest, his posture betrayed irritation. The expert continued. The defendant tracked law enforcement response patterns. He cataloged investigative weaknesses. He analyzed outcomes. To what end? The prosecutor asked. The expert paused. To avoid being predictable. Novak felt the air in the room change. Evan had always believed intelligence made him untouchable. But intelligence, laid bare, no longer looked clever. It looked deliberate. The defense attempted to pivot. They emphasized age, development, the plasticity of the adolescent brain. They argued that Evan was experimenting with ideas, not acting on them. That he was role-playing intellectual scenarios without understanding their gravity. Then the witness stand was called again, the neighbor. The man's voice shook as he described the boy standing at the perimeter of the scene, hands in pockets, calm, observing officers instead of the aftermath. I remember thinking, the man said, that he looked like someone taking notes without writing anything down. Evan stared straight ahead. He didn't look angry, he looked confused. Because this detail hadn't been part of his calculations. When it was time for Evan to speak, his attorney advised against it. Evan insisted. He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket, a gesture Novak recognized instantly, self-soothing and conscious. I never hurt anyone, Evan said clearly. And I never planned to, the statement echoed. But you studied how people get away with it, the prosecutor replied. Evan hesitated, just long enough. I studied how people misunderstand things, he said, including intentions. Novak felt a familiar chill. Evan was still trying to reframe the narrative to turn the courtroom into an extension of the interrogation room. But the judge leaned forward. Intent, the judge said slowly, is not only what you say. It's what you prepare for. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. The final evidence was subtle and devastating. A psychologist took the stand, not to diagnose Evan, not to label him, but to explain a pattern. Some individuals, she said, derive identity not from actions, but from perceived superiority over systems. They test boundaries not to break rules but to prove the rules can't stop them. The prosecutor asked one question. And what happens when the system responds differently than expected? The psychologist didn't hesitate. The individual escalates, because the need isn't victory. It's validation. Novak closed her eyes. That was it. The missing piece. This was never about a single act. It was about proving a theory with himself as the exception. The verdict wasn't sensational. It was restrained, calculated, measured. Evan was found responsible for conspiracy, obstruction, and premeditated planning tied to multiple investigations. The court ordered long-term containment, evaluation, and monitoring. No dramatic outburst followed. No breakdown. Evan simply nodded, as if acknowledging data. Later, as Novak walked out into the fading light, Miles caught up to her. He still thinks he was right, Miles said quietly. Novak nodded. That's the most dangerous part. Do you think this stops him? Novak didn't answer immediately. Understanding a mind like that doesn't end the threat, she said finally. It only explains how close it came. She paused at the steps, looking back at the courthouse doors. He believed he could manipulate the system, she added. What he didn't realize is that the system doesn't need to be manipulated. It only needs time. And as they walked away, one unsettling thought lingered. Evan Harper wasn't unique. He was a warning. If this case unsettled you, the next one reveals how the same pattern went unnoticed for far too long. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when it does.